If I had been asked what was the hardest thing for me in life, I would have answered without hesitation, to find a life partner, and for me, such a person was my wife, whom I loved and provided for. But something went wrong, and she destroyed our family. I was reading the day's news on my computer when I heard a loud knocking at the front door. Since I'm still a city guy at heart, I had locked the door when I got home earlier, so it took me a moment to unlock it. The sheriff was standing there, panting as if he had run from his car to my porch. "There's been an accident, Doc," he gasped. "You'd think with the low population and straight roads out here in Oklahoma, there would be very few car accidents, but that's not the case. Once you leave the big cities and get off the interstates, our highways are often narrow two-lane blacktops, and too many of our bridges are in disrepair. But people still drive like they're on an interstate, and as a result, getting called out to a crash site was a common occurrence for the only doctor in 4 counties. "I'll be there right away, George. Just let me grab my bag," I said, turning to go. "No, Doc," he replied, and it wasn't his words but the strange tone in his voice that made me turn back around. "It's Bonnie," he said, his voice choked, and suddenly I noticed the tears on his cheeks. A surge of adrenaline shot through my system, and I immediately started to pant. "Oh God, where is she?" I demanded. "We've got to get there!" But George just stood there, unable to meet my eyes. "She's gone, Doc. She didn't make it. I've treated a fair number of gunshot victims, and they always tell me the same thing. There's no pain when you're first hit. Your body just goes numb." At that moment, I felt as though I had been shot in the chest, and I staggered, trying to keep my balance as I went numb all over. "No, that can't be right," I yelled. "I can save her if I get there in time." But as I tried to push past him to run to the police car, George grabbed me and held me back. "You can't go, Doc. You can't see her. It was bad, Doc, real bad. I'm so sorry," he said through his tears. The rest of that night was a blur. Phone calls, hushed voices, people coming and going, and tense conversations over crackling radios. One thing I do remember is the nervous deputy who stayed with me after George had to leave. I also remember that, like a gunshot wound, once the numbness started to fade, the pain became unbearable. At some point during that awful night, when the agony became too much, I went to my medical bag, pulled out a vial of morphine, and, when the deputy wasn't looking, gave myself an injection. I lay down on my bed, and oblivion came quickly and mercifully, just as I'd hoped. I know it was cowardly, but I couldn't bear to stay conscious any longer that night. When I woke up, the smell of food hit me immediately. I stumbled out of the bedroom and stared in amazement at the array of chafing dishes and plastic containers on the kitchen counters. Then, as the last traces of morphine left my mind, I suddenly realized why my neighbors had brought so much food. "Oh, Bonnie," I cried, collapsing into the nearest chair. I had only delayed the pain. Now there was no escape. George returned later that morning and tried to answer the questions he knew I had. "She was on State Route 296, coming back from the office in Arrow Point after work," he said. "We think she must have fallen asleep at the wheel because her Honda crossed the center line and collided head-on with an oncoming truck. The truck driver didn't make it either." I tried desperately not to imagine what the accident scene looked like. The days that followed were a disjointed haze of emotional turmoil, with only a few memories standing out clearly. One of the most painful was meeting Bonnie's father at the funeral home. He was a large man, as tall as I am, and still remarkably strong from working on the ranch, even in his 60s. But on that day, he looked like he'd aged a decade. He walked into the parlor hunched over, taking slow, unsteady steps. When he saw me, he came over and embraced me. "I'm so sorry," he managed to say before breaking down in tears. I held onto him tightly, my own tears soaking into his suit. The people around us fell silent, awkward, and unsure of how to react. Eventually, he guided me to her coffin. Although I'd seen hundreds of bodies in my time, I was dreading the sight of my wife. The casket was partially closed, revealing only her face. We all knew the reason, though no one wanted to mention it. That's not Bonnie, I thought as I looked at her embalmed face. The Bonnie I knew was full of laughter and zest for life. The face before me seemed like a poorly painted portrait. Oh, Bonnie, I thought, reaching for my handkerchief, why did you have to go? Why couldn't it have been me instead? When I first moved to Millersville, I was a bachelor, and it seemed like every family in town was eager to introduce me to their eligible daughters as soon as possible. I was invited to so many Sunday dinners, church events, family picnics, and high school football games that it became hard to keep track. At each event, I'd be introduced to one or more daughters, ranging in age from around 40, I'd guess, to as young as 16, heaven forbid. It would be flattering to think that my looks and charm made me such a sought-after match, but anyone who's been through medical school knows that doctors have an advantage when it comes to attracting the opposite intimacy. The combination of good earning potential, a comfortable lifestyle, and a respected place in society makes us highly desirable for marriage. They used to say that a doctor who can't find a spouse is a doctor who doesn't want one. What these eager potential partners might not realize is that we doctors have been advised to be cautious in our pursuits and to avoid getting caught up in anything serious, at least until we've found the one. So, while I was polite and friendly with the young women of Millersville, and even went on a few dates, I made sure to keep things proper and restrained, even when some of them were quite forward with their intentions. The last thing I wanted was to deal with an angry parent in a town where the most popular truck accessory was a gun rack. I was so careful, in fact, that one of my patients mentioned hearing a frustrated young woman say she thought I was gay. I just smiled, assured him that wasn't the case, and waited for the right time. Then I met Bonnie. I had driven 50 miles to Arrow Point to visit a government office. When I walked into the reception area, she was working at the front desk. Have you ever been walking under a cloudy sky when the sun suddenly breaks through? That's how I felt when I saw her. I don't think I stumbled on my way to the desk, but I can't be sure because my brain was definitely not in charge of my body, or my mouth, as it soon became clear. I'm here to see Mr. Rogers. I stammered. I know who you are, she snapped at me, before spinning around in her chair and walking away. I had no idea what I had done to upset her, but I was determined to find out and make it right. So I scheduled another appointment with Mr. Rogers for the following week. When I walked into the lobby, she actually rolled her eyes in irritation when she saw me. The next week, when I showed up again, she looked at me in surprise. "Why are you here? Mr. Rogers is off today," she said. "I didn't come to see him," I replied. "I was hoping you'd have lunch with me." "You drove 50 miles just to have lunch with me?" she asked, astonished. Blushing, I nodded. She rolled her eyes again. "Well, all right," she said reluctantly. That's how it all started. I was stunned when I found out that she was Richard Miller's daughter. I expected that the head of the district commission would proudly present his only daughter, as well as other prominent figures of the district, and perhaps he did so. But as I have already understood, Bonnie was very independent, and it was not easy to convince her to change her mind. I know this because I have been courting her for more than 6 months, so that she would take our relationship seriously. Even after we got married, she refused to quit her job at Arrow Point. She proudly informed me that she had achieved her position on her own, without the influence of her father, and I had no choice but to agree, although now I regret that she had to travel 50 miles to work every day. Despite her independence, after our engagement, Bonnie turned out to be surprisingly conservative in intimate relationships. She was happy with her body and wasn't shy about kissing and fooling around, but she made it clear that intimate relationships were forbidden before the wedding. I found her position rather old-fashioned, even for rural Oklahoma, but it was impossible to convince her otherwise. By that time, I was so much in love with her that it didn't matter anymore. During our honeymoon, I took her to the Virgin Islands, and in a secluded hotel on St. Croix, we had intimacy for the first time. Bonnie wasn't a virgin, which surprised me, but I chose not to ask, and she never gave an explanation. However, it was clear that she did not have much experience in making love, as Ovid called it. All I can say is that she was a diligent student. I remember the final night before we were set to leave the island. After making love, she went out onto the balcony to gaze at the ocean. When I joined her, the moonlight revealed tears in her eyes. Concerned, I asked, "Is everything all right?" She turned to me and buried her face in my chest. "This has all been so overwhelming," she whispered. "I'll never forget it, for as long as I live." I think I may have had a few happy tears in my own eyes as well. Now, at the funeral home, those memories kept flooding back, and I was powerless to stop them, despite the pain they caused. In medical school, they teach you to be sympathetic towards your patients, but not empathetic. It's important to feel sympathy, they said, but if you start sharing your patient's emotions, your effectiveness as a doctor will diminish. You might even go insane, carrying all that grief. As people came through the receiving line to offer their condolences, I was painfully aware of how little comfort their words brought me. They'd say, "We're so sorry for your loss," but I knew their sorrow was nothing compared to mine. "She was such a devoted wife," they'd remark, but I knew they couldn't truly grasp just how devoted she was. "She's in a better place," someone suggested, but all I could think was that it certainly wasn't better for me. Finally, we stood at the gravesite as the Baptist preacher delivered the final words before her coffin was lowered into the rich brown earth forever. Trying to hold back my tears, I glanced around at the other mourners. Of everyone there, I thought, the only person who feels her loss as deeply as I do is her father. The old man was being supported by Richard Jr., his reddened eyes fixed on the resting place of his only daughter's remains. After the burial was completed, the crowd slowly began to disperse. I overheard one of the county commissioners remark, "I hope Richard will be all right." Bonnie was very close to her father. She'd do anything for him, and he wanted everything for her. Losing her like this could be the end of him. I glanced back at her father as he slowly walked away from the gravesite and thought that the commissioner's concern might be justified. Considering the pain I was feeling, I wondered if her loss might take its toll on me as well. An elderly woman approached me and gently patted my hand. "I just hope you won't be leaving us now," she said. Before I could respond, her husband quickly silenced her. "Martha, how could you say that? Of course, Dr. Robertson isn't going to leave Millersville." Leaving hadn't even crossed my mind. Then again, I hadn't thought about much else besides getting through Bonnie's burial. Still, her comment struck me as odd, especially at a time like this, but it also made me reflect on how I ended up in Millersville in the first place. I had always wanted to be a doctor. It's strange. I can't recall what initially sparked my interest in medicine, but whenever someone asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, my answer was always a doctor. When you're young, every job seems equally promising, and any career appears within reach. But over time, you begin to understand the intricate mix of intelligence, skills, interests, aptitude, and many other factors needed to succeed in any career. Once all these factors are considered, another significant hurdle emerges: the cost of preparation. Few careers are as expensive to pursue as medicine. After doing the math, I realized I would be around $250,000 in debt by the time I was ready to practice. As if that wasn't overwhelming enough, my dad's heart attack during my undergraduate years dealt what seemed like a fatal blow to my hopes of a medical career. However, this country offers a great program to tackle this issue: the National Health Service Corps, NHSC. The NHSC was created to solve two problems. The first is over-specialization. Every medical student knows that the highest salaries are in the specialties, which has led to a shortage of physicians in less lucrative fields like internal medicine, family practice, and pediatrics. The second, and arguably more urgent problem, is the lack of doctors in underserved rural areas. In Manhattan, you can hardly walk a block without passing a doctor's office, but in the heartland, You might have to drive a day or more to find one. The NHSC offered me a deal. If I agreed to become a primary care physician and relocate to an underserved area, the government would forgive the massive debt I'd accumulate as long as I stayed there long enough. So, I made an early commitment that allowed me to receive the support I needed through medical school, internship, and residency. Essentially, I agreed to trade the first few years of my practice to the NHSC in exchange for covering my tuition and expenses. It was a trade-off I was more than willing to make. I wouldn't get rich, but I could pursue my dream in a place that truly needed my services. I was happy to sign up. In my second year of residency, Oklahoma emerged as a likely destination for my service. I had never been to Oklahoma before, and the idea had a certain romantic appeal. How hard could it be to spend a few years treating patients amid fields of wheat, towering corn, and the prairie where pioneers once made their homes? And that's how I ended up in Millersville. When I first met Richard Miller, the head of the Miller County Commission, he made it clear that his town expected more than just a 4-year commitment from me. His family had been living in north-central Oklahoma since the Great Land Run of 1889, which explained the origin of both the county and town's names. Richard was determined to ensure that the town would still be thriving for his son and grandchildren. It turns out that Millersville had another NHSC doctor a few years back, but he didn't stay long. For the town's leaders, that was a disaster. Richard told me, "A town without a doctor is a town that's dying. Couples hesitate to start families, people begin to leave, and the town slowly withers away. We can't let that happen here." They certainly made it hard to leave. They had an office ready for me, and I was surprised at how well equipped it was. But before I could get too impressed with the office, Richard outdid himself by showing me the house where I'd be living, rent-free. It was a beautifully renovated 2-story Victorian home, and when I remarked that it was much too big for my needs, Richard just smiled and assured me that I'd grow into it over time. It wasn't just the big perks that made the town so appealing. It was all the small gestures that made me feel genuinely wanted. From the day I committed to Millersville, I became something of a local celebrity. Everyone in town seemed to know and like me, and they made a point of nodding and smiling whenever they saw me. The county commissioners even started consulting me on various matters, quickly praising whatever small advice I offered. I had gone from being a struggling med student to an important figure almost overnight. Of course, I knew what they were trying to do, provide every possible incentive to keep me in Millersville beyond my NHSC commitment. So when they began introducing me to their daughters, I wasn't naive. The good parents of Millersville understood that the bonds of marriage would be the strongest incentive to keep me there. Even though it was all so obvious, I couldn't help but be moved by the sincerity of the people and their apparent warmth, trust, and affection. Yes, they needed me to stay, but I also genuinely believed they were glad it was me and not someone else, and that made me feel good. Then, when I met Bonnie, everything else faded away. Falling for the only young woman in town who hadn't pursued me reassured me somehow. Her hesitation made me feel that when she finally agreed to be with me, I had truly won her over. When she consented to be my bride, any doubts I had about staying in Millersville disappeared. When we finally got married, I knew life couldn't get any better, until that night when everything fell apart. In the week following the funeral, food continued to arrive at my house. I knew it was a traditional way of showing concern, but I was still touched. It felt as though my friends and neighbors wanted to ensure I had the sustenance they feared I might struggle to provide for myself in my time of grief. That simple gesture meant much more to me than the customary words of sympathy. I took a week off after the funeral, and all my appointments were miraculously rescheduled. That was a relief because I was in no shape to handle patients. But I didn't just sit idle. I discovered that death brings a surprisingly long list of tasks that need attention, and I threw myself into them diligently. Every task was agonizingly painful, but I wanted to get rid of these sharp reminders as quickly as possible so they wouldn't keep tormenting me. One of the last tasks on my list was a visit to the sheriff's office. I could tell George wasn't pleased to see me, but he gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Dr. Robertson, Mark, are you sure you want to go through this? The more details you learn, the harder it will be for you." "Thank you, George, but I need to know what happened. I won't be able to heal until I do." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair and clasped his hands together. "As I mentioned before, it's impossible to know exactly what happened. We're guessing she must have fallen asleep at the wheel because the road where the accident occurred is straight and level. Her car crossed the center line and never slowed down. She didn't hit the brakes. There were no skid marks on the highway at all. We estimate both vehicles were traveling around 65 miles per hour." I shuddered. The kinetic energy of such a collision would have been devastating. "Go on," I said. "What about Bonnie?" He kept his eyes on his papers. "She had her seatbelt on and the airbag deployed as it should have. But at that speed, the passenger area was partially crushed and she was pinned in the wreckage." I fought hard not to picture it, my beautiful wife, broken like a bird that had flown into a glass window. But I had to know. So she was trapped in the car with multiple injuries. Do we know what caused her death? Was it shock? I asked in a whisper. George's head dropped even lower. Somehow, during the crash, her left arm was severed. She bled out, Doc. He paused. If it's any comfort, it must have happened quickly. Unbidden, a diagram from my anatomy class came to mind, showing the brachial artery branching from the carotid and running down the arm. No, I thought. It wouldn't have taken long at all. What about the other vehicle? I inquired. It was a Dodge pickup. The driver likely died on impact. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Who was he? I asked. His name was Taylor Johnson. He was a rancher from Noble County, east of here. His wife mentioned he had been hunting white-tailed deer in the Black Kettle Wildlife Management area. He must have been on his way home when the accident occurred. I shook my head. The name didn't ring any bells. One more thing, George, I said. I'd like to see the autopsy report. Doc, are you certain? Please, I insisted. I'm a doctor. It's the only way I can find closure. He stood and retrieved a file from an old metal cabinet. Automation hadn't reached this part of Oklahoma much. It's only a partial, Doc, he explained. There wasn't much doubt about the cause of death. I examined the report. George was right. The coroner had only conducted a visual inspection. The loss of the left arm was noted, as I had expected. However, it was painful to read about the multiple broken ribs and cracked sternum. Although the report didn't list them, I knew she must have suffered severe internal injuries. Then there was the fractured skull. The broken femurs and cracked pelvis seemed almost incidental. Altogether, there were at least 6 potentially fatal injuries, but the severed brachial artery meant that by the time the EMT reached her, she was already gone. Oddly, I felt a bit better after reading the report. It seemed likely that she had been knocked unconscious by the blow to her head and had bled out quickly while unconscious. If that was the case, she hadn't suffered, which was a small consolation. Another comfort was knowing that there was nothing I could have done for her, even if I had been at the scene of the wreck. I doubted she would have survived, even if the accident had happened right in front of a major hospital. I handed the report back to George and went home. In an odd way, the autopsy report gave me more closure than her funeral had. The following week, I returned to work. There was nothing more I could do for Bonnie, so I felt it was time to focus on helping the living. My Thursday afternoon schedule was free, so I was surprised when my nurse informed me that a Hillary Johnson was in the waiting room and wanted to see me. A quick check of our records confirmed she hadn't been in before, so I pulled out a fresh form, preparing to examine her. A rather attractive woman, about my age, entered the office. I motioned for her to sit in the chair beside the examination table, but she remained standing, arms crossed, staring at me intensely. Her demeanor was unsettling, but I attempted to begin the examination. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Johnson?" I asked in my usual professional tone. She uncrossed her arms, clenched her fists, and her face began to flush with anger. "You can tell me why your wife killed my husband," she suddenly shouted, then covered her face and began to cry. "Oh my God," I thought, "this must be the wife of the man who was driving the pickup truck." Part of me wanted to go around the desk to comfort her, while another part of me wanted to retreat from her obvious pain. But her words triggered my own grief, and I found myself frozen, unable to move. After a few long moments, she seemed to regain some composure around the same time I emerged from the fog of memories that had consumed me. I was the first to break the silence. "I'm truly sorry about your husband, Mrs. Johnson. I'm still trying to come to terms with my own loss." Her expression softened slightly, as she seemed to realize that I was also grieving, but the torment was still evident in her eyes. "I just don't understand how she could have been so careless. If only she had pulled over to take a nap, just stopped for a while to rest." "I don't understand it either," I replied earnestly. "She made that drive every evening at the same time. I keep thinking about it, wishing she had called me to pick her up. Anything but what actually happened." I tried to speak calmly, but I couldn't keep the anguish out of my voice. Mrs. Johnson must have sensed it because her tone softened further. "I know it wasn't your fault. If I'm being honest, it probably wasn't her fault either. It's just so painful, and I felt like I had to come. Now I regret it. I can see how much you're suffering, too." "It's all right, Mrs. Johnson," I said. "We're both searching for answers in a sea of questions. We're both grasping for some way to undo what's happened, even though we know we can't. It's only natural to feel angry at others involved, even if they were powerless to prevent the tragedy." Then my professional instincts kicked in. "Have you been able to sleep since the accident?" I asked her gently. When she shook her head, I quickly wrote out a prescription. "You can take one of these before bed if you'd like. Just be sure not to mix them with alcohol." She thanked me and stood to leave after I handed her the prescription. Before she walked out, I asked her, "Please stay in touch, Mrs. Johnson. I'd like to know how you're doing." She nodded gratefully, and after she left, I felt a little better knowing I had helped, even if only a little. Over the following days, her visit kept resurfacing in my thoughts. Her questions unsettled me, despite knowing there were no clear answers. Sometimes, terrible things happen to good people for no apparent reason. But understanding this doesn't equate to accepting it, and the fact that I couldn't provide answers to Mrs. Johnson's questions made acceptance even more difficult. Had nothing else occurred, I believe time would have gradually begun to heal me. But that relief was not granted. A week later, I received a request from a Ms. Nicole Claiborne, representing an insurance company in Oklahoma City, to meet with me. She emphasized that her visit wasn't for sales purposes, but refused to disclose the reason beforehand. All she mentioned was that it related to my late wife. Reluctantly, I agreed, bracing myself for the emotional wounds to be reopened once again. When Ms. Claiborne arrived at the scheduled time, I saw an attractive young woman dressed in a business suit that would have been considered conservative, if not for a slit in the skirt that rose higher than I had expected. I found it somewhat inappropriate for her to wear such attire when meeting a man still mourning his wife, and I made a point of keeping my gaze at eye level. "Dr. Robertson?" she began. "I'm here because your wife was covered by a life insurance policy her father had purchased for her. You are listed as the beneficiary. Were you aware of this?" "No," I replied. "I had no idea." Ms. Claiborne nodded. "The policy includes a double indemnity clause that applies in the event of accidental death. In this case, the policy's face value was $100,000, so the payout, assuming the claim is approved, will be $200,000. She studied me carefully as she spoke. When I didn't react, she continued. "As part of our standard procedure in such situations, We routinely investigate any untimely death before processing a claim. I don't see what there is to investigate, I responded coldly. The police told me she must have fallen asleep at the wheel before the crash. It seems pretty straightforward to me. She paused for a few moments, then conspicuously crossed her legs, allowing the fabric of her skirt to fall open. I ignored the gesture. $200,000 is a substantial amount of money. What are you planning to do with it? She asked abruptly. I was frustrated with the woman for her inappropriate behavior and the tone of her questions. I was also upset with myself for the tears that welled up in my eyes, despite my efforts to stay composed. Mrs. Claiborne, the woman I loved, died tragically just a few weeks ago. Money is the last thing on my mind. If you don't have any more questions, could you please leave me alone? She adjusted her posture, uncrossing her legs and sitting up straight while carefully smoothing her skirt to conceal what she had so readily shown moments earlier. Her entire demeanor shifted, and an apologetic expression crossed her face. Dr. Robertson, I deeply regret my questions and the attitude I displayed. Please accept my sincere apology. Noticing the confusion on my face, she continued quickly. Dr. Robertson, I've been conducting insurance investigations for longer than you might imagine. Over time, I've learned to use certain distractions. She smoothed the slit in her skirt to help me gauge the people I deal with. Some have not been as they appeared, and their reactions to these distractions have helped me uncover the truth. In your case, I'm now convinced that you are a grieving widower who genuinely loved his late wife, and I am truly sorry for your loss. I suppose I understand, I said slowly, but why put me through that in the first place? Surely there shouldn't be any doubts about what happened. As I spoke, I remembered Hillary Johnson's visit and felt a pang of unease. The investigator leaned closer. Dr. Robertson, another lesson I've learned in this job is to trust my instincts. My gut tells me that you're a decent man seeking the truth about his wife, so I will be completely honest with you. But first, let me warn you. I have to consider some unsettling possibilities. If I propose something that offends you, please hear me out. I didn't know your wife, so my questions are those I might ask anyone in similar circumstances. Please don't take it personally. I nodded uncertainly. It made sense that an investigator would need to consider every angle of a situation, but I still couldn't see more than one perspective in this case. She quickly demonstrated how mistaken I was. Dr. Robertson, I told you that I trust my instincts. My instincts keep questioning how your late wife could have fallen asleep at the wheel before the accident. I don't believe she did. I was taken aback. If she didn't fall asleep, what else could have caused her to veer into an oncoming truck? Are you suggesting she might have been drugged? I asked in disbelief. Absolutely not, she responded quickly. On the contrary, I don't think she was impaired in any way. I looked at her with curiosity. How can you be so sure? I inquired. Maybe she had a really tough day at work and was unusually exhausted. Perhaps she hadn't eaten lunch and her blood sugar suddenly dropped. There are many factors that could have caused her to drift off just before the accident. When was the last time you drove to Arrow Point? She asked. It's been quite a while, I replied. Several months at least. I'm not exactly sure. She nodded. 2 months ago, Miller County started repairs on the bridge over the river between Arrow Point and Millersville. The repairs require any vehicle crossing the bridge to slow down to 35 miles per hour and then make a sharp lane change in the middle of the bridge. Your wife would have had to be both alert and awake to navigate that bridge. That doesn't mean she couldn't have fallen asleep after crossing the bridge, I argued. It's not impossible, she conceded, but the accident happened only about a mile past the bridge. At the speed she was traveling, that would have been approximately 60 seconds later. It doesn't seem likely that she would have fallen asleep just a minute after successfully making a major speed and steering adjustment. I sat there in silence. Bonnie made that drive every evening after work, so she would have been accustomed to those conditions. I couldn't help but wonder what could have gone wrong after all these years. What Nicole Claiborne told me was extremely unsettling. "What about a mechanical failure?" I eventually asked. "Could something like a blowout or a steering issue have caused her car to drift into the other lane?" "Yes, it's possible," she responded softly. "But I've already been to the salvage yard to inspect your wife's car. The tires were intact, and the damage to the suspension and steering appeared to be consistent with the accident." "But maybe—" I began, but she raised her hand to stop me. "More importantly," she continued, "we retrieved the onboard computer from her car, which recorded exactly what happened in the last few seconds before the crash. Her Honda was traveling at 64.8 miles per hour when the steering wheel was turned left, causing the car to veer into the opposite lane. The wheel was then straightened, and the brakes were never applied." I leaned back in my chair, stunned. It sounded as though Bonnie had deliberately steered her Honda into the oncoming truck. How could that have been an accident? But if it wasn't, the only other explanation seemed to be suicide. I didn't think she had any reason to take her own life. Ms. Claiborne's voice cut through my thoughts. "Did you or your wife know Taylor Johnson?" she asked gently. "I'd never heard of him before the accident," I replied, "and Bonnie never mentioned him. Besides, I understand he lived in Noble County, far from here, so it's unlikely she'd have ever met him. Why do you ask?" Her face looked weary. "You might not like this, but I have to consider other possibilities. What if the accident wasn't accidental? What if she deliberately tried to kill both Jason Taylor and herself?" The thought took my breath away. "That's impossible," I exclaimed. "Why would she do something like that?" "I can think of at least 3 reasons," she replied calmly. Raising her hand, she held up her index finger. "First, it's possible that Taylor Johnson was a sworn enemy, and she felt compelled to sacrifice her life to protect her family from that danger." She touched her middle finger. "Another possibility is that she and Mr. Johnson were lovers, and in a fit of jealous rage, she killed both him and herself." Grasping her ring finger and looking away, she continued, "Or, if they were indeed lovers, she might have wanted to keep anyone from discovering she was pregnant with his child." I tried to stay composed and rational, but her last suggestion pushed me over the edge. "Damn it, that's not true. Bonnie loved me, and she wasn't pregnant. What do you want? To exhume her body and conduct a full autopsy? I won't allow it." She quickly moved over, kneeling in front of me and taking my hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm not your enemy, and I hate that I have to be so cynical and suspicious about people. Please forgive me." Although her suggestions were outrageous, her apology softened my anger. "All right, Ms. Claiborne. I understand you're just doing your job." Still remorseful, she looked up at me searchingly. "Please, call me Nicole. And may I call you Mark? It might help if we're going to find out what really happened." "All right, Nicole," I replied. "But I still think you're wrong about Bonnie. For what it's worth, I agree. I don't believe any of those scenarios are true. First of all 3 would have required Bonnie to know exactly when Taylor Johnson would be on that highway. But Mrs. Taylor told me she had no idea when her husband would return from his hunting trip. As for Bonnie, she left Arrow Point at her usual time, so she clearly didn't make any special arrangements to meet Johnson. Moreover, I checked her cell phone records, and she neither made nor received any calls in the hours leading up to the accident, so I don't see how she could have coordinated their meeting. "So, it was just a coincidence, a random meeting?" I asked. "It's possible," Nicole admitted, "but that still leaves us with what looks like a deliberate attempt to collide with Johnson's truck. Maybe we're approaching this from the wrong angle. Could it be that Taylor Johnson wanted to kill Bonnie?" I asked. "I've thought about that," she replied, "but how could he have gotten her to drive into his lane?" She stood up. "Mark, I realize I've upset you, and I apologize again. The thing is, nothing about this case adds up for me, and I can't just let it go without digging a little deeper." I slumped in my chair. "Ms. Claiborne, Nicole, I'll admit that I've been wavering on this ever since the accident. I need to know what really happened too." She handed me a business card. "If you think of anything that might help clarify all this, please don't hesitate to call me." She looked at me with sympathy. "Call me, even if you just need someone to talk to." Then she turned and left my office. I had thought I was in turmoil before. Now the idea that my late wife might have taken some mysterious secret to the grave was like a fresh wound before the old ones had even begun to heal. It was bad enough that Bonnie had died in a tragic accident. The questions Nicole had raised filled my mind with unsettling suspicions. Surely none of those scenarios could be true, yet the many unanswered questions were enough to stir up paranoia. That night, before going to bed, I took one of my own sleeping pills. The next day was Saturday, and my office closed in the afternoon. After seeing my last patient, I got in my car and began driving to Arrow Point. Until now, I had avoided going there because I couldn't bear the thought of seeing the place where my beloved Bonnie's life had ended. But now, I felt I had no choice but to go there myself and try to make sense of what had happened. Even though I had been living in Oklahoma for nearly 2 years, I still wasn't accustomed to the long distances. Bonnie had thought nothing of commuting every day between Millersville and Arrow Point, but to me, that kind of drive would have been a real burden. I suppose when you grow up on the prairie, your perspective on distance is different. But if this commute was so routine for her, I wondered, what made that terrible night different? What could have led her to her death on this long, straight stretch of highway? I deliberately avoided the spot where I estimated the accident had occurred and continued driving into Arrow Point. I wanted to experience the return trip the way she had, so I went to Bonnie's office, made a U-turn in the parking lot, and headed back onto the highway. After a while, I reached the bridge and immediately understood Nicole's point. It would have been impossible to speed through the construction safely. If you weren't fully alert, you could easily end up hitting one of the concrete barriers that enforced the lane shift. As soon as I passed the bridge, I accelerated to 65 miles per hour. I checked my watch and noted the odometer reading after 60 seconds had passed. Then, I pulled over, made sure the road was clear, and made another U-turn to head back to the accident site. It seemed unlikely to me that someone could drift off to sleep in such a short time. I pulled off to the side of the road, got out, and started looking around. The wreckage crew had apparently done a thorough job. The only traces of the accident I could find were some shards of broken glass and plastic, and a few strips of chrome body molding. Then something in the grass caught my eye, and when I walked over, I found a small wooden cross with Bonnie Miller, R.I.P., and the date inscribed on it. I don't know who had placed the marker, but when I saw it, all I could think about was the young woman I had met in Arrow Point. Once again, tears stung my eyes. After some time, I gathered myself and continued the drive back to Millersville, feeling more burdened than ever. Seeing the accident site made me miss Bonnie deeply, but it also left me more unsettled than before. I began to doubt much of what I had believed about her accident. "Oh, Bonnie, what really happened?" I asked in despair. For the next 2 weeks, I found myself repeatedly driving to Arrow Point and back, almost obsessively. I wasn't sure if I was honoring my wife's memory or seeking answers to a mystery, but I found nothing that could help with either. After several unsuccessful trips, I realized I needed to take a different approach. So, when I arrived at the office where Bonnie had worked, I parked, went inside, and asked to speak with her supervisor, Mr. Rogers. When I gave my name, he appeared quickly, perhaps due to the respect given to the only doctor in a 4-county area. Mr. Rogers expressed his condolences and then sat with me, making small talk over a cup of terrible coffee about Bonnie and her work. It seemed he was trying to flatter me as he kept praising her as an employee. "She was fantastic," he said enthusiastically. We would have loved to keep her full-time, but I suppose a doctor's wife doesn't need the extra hours, he added in an overly complimentary tone. I stared at him in shock. I had thought Bonnie had a full-time job. Trying to mask my surprise, I asked him, "Could you remind me, Mr. Rogers, how many hours a week was she working here?" "Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., 20 hours a week," he responded quickly. "She reduced her hours to part-time right before you two got married. I guess she wanted some extra morning time with you," he said with a knowing look. Then, realizing he was speaking about a deceased woman, he awkwardly stammered and apologized. I dismissed his apology, thanked him for his assistance, and then went home with a gnawing unease in my stomach. Bonnie had always been protective of her job. Despite my repeated assurances that she didn't need to work, she insisted. "I need my own money in case you kick me out," she'd laugh, and I saw it as just another sign of her strong, independent nature. Now, though, it seemed like there might be more to it, but I wasn't sure what. When I got home, I went straight to the box where her bank statements were kept. Bonnie had maintained her own checking account for gas, work meals, and other incidental expenses. I had always admired her desire to be financially independent, but now I felt there was something more to uncover. The bank statements confirmed what Rogers had told me. Each month, I could see her paychecks being automatically deposited into her account. I reviewed the past 2 years and noticed that her paychecks had been cut in half shortly before our marriage. She had never mentioned this to me. I hoped to find an explanation in her canceled checks, but everything seemed normal. What was going on? Feeling exhausted, I returned to my desk and called Nicole's cell phone after locating her business card. "This is Mark Robertson, Nicole. I don't understand what's happening, but I think you're onto something." I explained what I had discovered, and she promised to come back to Millersville as soon as possible. Before hanging up, she said, "Don't do anything hasty, Mark. Wait until I get there, please." I now had even more questions, and no one besides Nicole with whom I felt comfortable discussing them. All I knew for certain was that Bonnie had been keeping secrets from me, and while I didn't know their nature, none of my guesses were pleasant. The next day, after my last appointment, I found myself driving back toward Arrow Point. I wasn't sure what I hoped to achieve, but I felt compelled to do something. The news from the day before was like a persistent worm in my brain, and I couldn't sit still, letting its restless burrowing drive me insane. The drive to Arrow Point was uneventful, but as I was waiting at an intersection to head back to Millersville, I heard someone calling my name. "Hey, Doc! Doc Robertson! Can you give me a lift?" I looked over to see Jared Porter waving his arms and running toward me. Jared was one of my patients, a healthy teenager from a good family. "What are you doing in Arrow Point, Jared?" I asked as he hopped into the front seat beside me. "And where's your car?" He flashed a big grin. "I'm dating a girl who lives here in Arrow Point. My car's in the shop, and she called saying she was lonely, so I hitched a ride. You know how it is when you miss your girl," he said with a smirk. Then he suddenly realized what he'd said, and his face turned pale. "Oh gosh, Doc, I'm sorry. I was talking about my girlfriend. I wasn't thinking about Mrs. He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "It's okay, Jared," I said softly. "I'm just glad I could give you a ride. Your mother would worry if you were stuck out on the highway." He nodded awkwardly, relieved to avoid further embarrassment. As we drove, we talked about school and his future plans. He was clear about wanting to leave Millersville as soon as possible. "There's nothing for me here," he said. "I'm hoping to get into OU and then live in Norman or OKC after I graduate." "You wouldn't consider coming back to Millersville?" I asked. "Not a chance," he said firmly. "All my friends feel the same way." While we were talking, I had been keeping an eye on my rearview mirror and noticed a truck speeding up behind us. It soon moved into the left lane to pass me. The young driver looked about Jared's age and gave a friendly wave as he went by. I wasn't feeling very friendly. I was driving 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, and the truck still passed me easily. Oklahoma roads often have long stretches where you can see for miles, and I noticed another car approaching us from the distance. To my horror, the truck that had just passed us abruptly veered into the oncoming lane. Moments later, the approaching car did the same, moving into my lane, so that the two vehicles passed each other head-on at 70 miles per hour. The car then swerved back into its lane, and as it zoomed past me on the left, I saw the grinning face of a teenage girl. As I watched the situation unfold, I instinctively eased off the gas and hit the brakes. My heart was racing as I pulled over to the side of the road. I heard Jared laughing next to me and turned to him with irritation. "What was that all about?" I demanded. "Hoo-ee," he exclaimed. "Heart of the prairie." "What are you talking about, Jared?" "Those two kids almost got killed." "Nah, they were fine. Didn't you see them stick their arms out the window?" he replied, demonstrating by holding his left arm up in an arc with his hand bent at a 45-degree angle. I stared at him in confusion. "Don't you get it?" he asked, tracing the motion on the dashboard. "One driver's left arm goes this way, the other driver's arm does the same. Together they make a heart of the prairie." I looked at him in disbelief. "Do all kids do that every time they pass each other on the highway?" "Oh no," he said quickly. "Not all kids, just the sweethearts. It's a way to say I love you." I didn't say anything more to Jared for the rest of the drive. I was in shock. It was late when I dropped Jared off at his parents' house. When I arrived home, I saw a rental car parked out front, and Nicole Claiborne was inside with the window rolled down. She gave me a big smile, held up a bag, and said, "I brought dinner with me." But when she saw the look on my face, her smile disappeared. Once she had set out the food on the dining room table and we started to eat, I began to recount what I had seen that afternoon and what Jared had told me. She shook her head in disgust. "You can never underestimate how foolish teenagers can be," she said. Then a realization struck her. "Oh my God, that's what happened to Bonnie," she exclaimed. She deliberately swerved into the other lane, expecting the oncoming driver to do the same. "Exactly," I replied, except the other driver wasn't aware of the game. "Because he wasn't the right person," she completed my thought. Then she shuddered. "That explains what happened to Bonnie's arm," she said, and I couldn't help but visualize the damage that could occur to an arm sticking out the window in an accident at that speed. I shook off the disturbing image and continued. "But if Taylor Johnson wasn't the right person, who was?" I asked. Nicole was ahead of me. "That's the wrong question," she said. "The real question is, why did Bonnie think he was the right person?" We looked at each other in realization. "The truck!" we exclaimed simultaneously. Taylor Johnson was driving a truck that Bonnie thought she recognized, Nicole continued breathlessly. She wanted to give her lover a sign, the heart of the prairie, but it wasn't him. She shook her head sadly. It was all just a terrible mistake, a foolish accident that never should have happened. When Nicole used the term lover, I felt the sting of pain once more, but this time it was accompanied by a rising wave of anger. I forced it down, knowing there was more to uncover. "So how can we figure out who Bonnie knew that drove a truck like Taylor Johnson's?" I asked. "I should be able to find that information online from the Department of Motor Vehicles," she replied, then went to fetch her iPad. When she returned, she was already examining the database. "All right," she said. "I've located the registration for Taylor Johnson's truck. Now I just need to check if its specifications match any other trucks in the area." "Good luck with that," I said, somewhat skeptical. "Everyone and their brother seems to have a pickup truck around here." "That's true," she agreed, "but we're searching for one that Bonnie would have recognized from afar. So, what distinguishing feature might have made her think she was passing her lover's truck?" I tried to focus on logic rather than emotion. "It would have had to be the color," I said. She looked at me with an approving smile, as if I were a standout student in her class. "Exactly," she said. And guess what? Taylor Johnson's truck was yellow, which isn't a common color these days. In fact, according to the DMV, there's only one yellow pickup truck of that make and model in Miller County, and it's registered to a Holden Callaway. Who's that? I asked, feeling a bit out of my depth. Let me check another database and see if I can find out, she said. After a moment, she looked at me triumphantly. According to this, he's a 28-year-old male living in Arrow Point. Shit, that's the same age as Bonnie, I said. Give me a minute. I think I might know where to find something useful. I headed to the attic and, after some searching, came back with a book in hand. I handed it to Nicole. It's Bonnie's high school yearbook, I said quietly. As she held the book in her lap, I flipped through the senior class photos until I found Holden Callaway's picture. We were looking at a handsome, slender boy with a goofy haircut and an ill-fitting suit. So? She asked after examining the photo. I turned to the next page and scanned down until I reached Bonnie's picture. Despite her youthful appearance, I could still see the woman she was destined to become. However, I didn't mention this to Nicole. Instead, I pointed out the message written in ballpoint pen below her photo. I love you, Bonnie Hart of the Prairie Forever Holden. They were high school sweethearts, Nicole whispered. Maybe it didn't end in high school, I suggested. Nicole looked at me, puzzled. It's still strange. I could understand if Bonnie was meeting Holden Callaway in Arrow Point. But why would she expect to see him driving back from Millersville? She set the yearbook aside and picked up her iPad again. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with surprise. I don't get it. This can't be right, she said. It says Holden works for the Miller Ranch. We continued talking late into the night. We had uncovered so much, but there were still questions that seemed just out of reach. I slumped on the couch, feeling a headache coming on, and turned to Nicole. I'm too tired to think about this any further tonight. I need to get some sleep. I looked at her earnestly. You're welcome to stay here if you'd like. She met my gaze carefully. Are you asking me to... No, I said. My emotions are still too raw, but right now I feel like everything in my life is falling apart and everything I believed was a lie. It would be nice to have a friend here, if that's not too much to ask. I took the master bedroom while she went to one of the guest rooms, but during the night, she came into my room and slipped under the covers. I was relieved because, amidst all the pain, lies, and betrayal, I really needed someone. She seemed to need me too, and we held on to each other like two survivors of a shipwreck. Eventually, we both fell asleep. The next morning I was making breakfast when she walked into the kitchen, dressed in her dress for success suit. As I prepared a plate for her, she asked, How are you feeling this morning, Mark? Not great, I replied honestly. I've gone from being a widower who just lost the woman he loved to discovering that my wife probably never loved me at all. I keep swinging between grief and anger, and I'm not sure how much more I can handle. As she listened, I noticed tears in her eyes, and I was moved. So that's what empathy looks like, I thought in amazement. Thank you for staying last night, I told her. The more I learn about what's been happening, the more I've felt like I don't have a friend in the world. It's been really lonely. Having you here helped. She came up to me and hugged me. I'm glad I could help, Mark, but you should know that I stayed because I wanted to, not just because you needed me. After a moment, I let her go. So, what's next for you? I asked. Are you able to stay? No, she answered. I have to leave, and I should go before we give your neighbors more to talk about. It's probably too late for that, I said, but it doesn't really matter. She gave me a thoughtful look. What are you planning to do, Mark? Don't worry, I reassured her. I'm not going to do anything reckless. I just need to get answers to a few remaining questions. She started to respond, but then hesitated. I have to head back to Oklahoma City today, she said. Now that we've confirmed Bonnie's death was an accident, you'll receive the insurance payout in your account. I nodded, though the money meant little to me under the circumstances. I'd figure out what to do with it later. I'd like to know what you discover, she continued. I mean, once everything is settled. I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know, if you want to. I understand, I said. She seemed like she wanted to say more, but instead leaned in and kissed me softly on the lips. Good luck, Mark, she said, before leaving. I felt a pang as she drove away. Her presence had been comforting, but I had to face the next step alone, and now the anger I had been holding back started to rise. After checking the clock again, I got ready and headed out to the car. I didn't want to risk entering the Miller property, so I parked on the side of the road, a mile or two away from the entrance. When I saw the green truck approaching, I started my engine and, at what I judged to be the last safe moment, pulled out in front of him. His desperate swerve to avoid hitting me sent him into a ditch. I then angled my car in front of his truck to block his escape and quickly got out. He stared at me through the window, his expression shifting from surprise to fear as he recognized me. "Get out of the truck, Holden," I shouted. "Get out, or I'll smash the window and drag you out," I repeated, brandishing the tire iron in my hand. I thought I'd have to make good on my threat. But then his shoulders slumped, and a look of resignation crossed his young face. He unlocked the door, pushed it open, and slowly stepped out to stand beside his truck. He didn't seem to have grown at all since his high school photo. I must have been 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier. "Go ahead. Beat me," he muttered. "You can kill me if you want. It doesn't matter to me. You can't hurt me more than I already hurt. She's gone, and I'll never see her again." I grabbed his arm. "I'm not going to hurt you unless I have to," I told him. "I just need you to come with me and answer some questions." I marched him over to my car and shoved him into the passenger seat. He seemed apathetic now, but I kept the tire iron within easy reach, just in case his attitude changed. I jerked the wheel hard and headed back towards Millersville. Once we were moving, I turned to face him. "When did it begin?" I demanded. "When did you and she first—" He looked at me as if I were an idiot. "Begin? We'd always been in love, even back in high school. She and I were going to get married after college, as soon as we had enough money to settle down. But then you showed up chasing after her, and her old man said she had to be nice to you for the town's sake." He glared at me defiantly. "She tried to resist. She loved me, not you." Then his eyes lost their fire. "But she loved her father, too, and he kept pushing her, saying it was her duty, that she had to do it if she loved him. She could never say no to Daddy," he said bitterly. "But she wouldn't give me up either," he added proudly. "So her daddy worked it all out. I had to live in Arrow Point so no one would see Bonnie and me together. But he gave me a job on his ranch, and every morning I'd drive there early. She'd leave town as if heading to work in Arrow Point, but then she'd circle back to the ranch to be with me." "But she did work in Arrow Point," I protested. "I talked to her supervisor." "Of course she did," Holder replied, frustrated. "She had to make it look real. But she only worked there in the afternoons. She spent the mornings with me." "I still don't get it. Why all the back and forth? Why didn't she just meet you in Arrow Point?" He shook his head in disgust. "Her daddy said we couldn't be together where people might see us and start gossiping, but I think he just wanted to keep us under his control." Then his expression turned to disdain. "Her old man was a real hard ass. Once Bonnie left for her job, he made me work like a dog on the ranch all afternoon. But when she was driving back to you in Millersville at night, I'd be heading back to Arrow Point. We'd pass each other on the way and always did the prairie heart sign to show we still loved each other, even when we were apart." I glanced at him again and saw anguish distort his young face. The night of the accident, her dad made me stay late doing some pointless chores. I thought I would meet her closer to Millersville, but she wasn't there." He began to cry openly, tears streaming down his cheeks like water over a dam. "I came upon the accident about a mile this side of the river. At first, I didn't know who it was. I just knew it was bad, but as I got closer, I recognized her Honda or what was left of it. The front was completely crushed, and she was trapped behind the wheel. Oh God, Doc, her arm was gone and there was blood everywhere. When I called her name, she opened her eyes, looked at me, and smiled. And then she died. He broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. And even though I hated him as my rival for Bonnie, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. I bet I'm the first person he's been able to tell this story to, I thought. He's kept it bottled up inside all this time. It's a wonder he's been able to function at all. You were the one who put that cross up on the highway, I said. He was too emotional to respond, but I knew it had to be true. That's why it said Bonnie Miller, not Bonnie Robertson, I added, more to myself than to him. After a while, he regained some composure and started talking again, as if he needed to let it all out. I called 911, but I didn't stay because I didn't want to make things worse for Bonnie. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. When I walked back to my truck, Doc, oh God, I found her arm. He started sobbing again, and I couldn't get anything more out of him. We pulled into Millersville, and I drove straight to the courthouse on the square. After parking, I went around, opened the door, and gently motioned for him to come with me. He didn't resist. I'm not even sure he knew where he was at that point. I approached the council chamber door, which had a sign that read, "In Session," but I pushed it open anyway. Richard Miller looked up, surprised by my intrusion, but quickly smiled. "Come in, Dr. Robertson. We were just discussing something important and would appreciate your wise advice." "No," I replied. "I have something important to discuss with you, all of you." I turned and signaled for Holden Calloway to enter. Miller turned pale when Holden walked in, and I noticed that the others around the table gasped as well. They all knew, I thought. They were all involved. Miller was the first to regain composure. "Listen, Mark, I don't know what this boy has been telling you, but don't waste your breath lying to me, Richard," I said sharply. "I know the whole story now. You were desperate to get a new doctor in Millersville, one who would actually stay. You were so desperate that you were willing to offer up your own daughter." I paused, looking at the others. "And any of you would have done the same with your own daughters." "That's hardly fair," Miller retorted. "What father wouldn't want his daughter to marry a respected doctor who could offer her a comfortable life? I only wanted Bonnie's happiness." "If you truly cared about Bonnie's happiness, you would have let her marry the man she really loved," I said angrily, gesturing towards Holden. "But no, you tried to force her to leave him for me, and when she wouldn't give him up, you set Holden up on the side. You turned him into some sort of male mistress, and made me an unwitting cuckold, and all of you knew it." He raised his hands as if to calm me. "Mark, I know you're upset, but you need to see the bigger picture. This town has over a century of history. We're trying to preserve the tradition of small-town America, a heritage for the next generation." "That's bullshit," I interrupted. "You weren't interested in tradition or heritage. All you cared about was protecting the value of your ranch." I turned to the other commissioners, pointing at them one by one. "And you were worried about your car dealership, and you just wanted to keep your bank's assets growing, and you were concerned about the sales in your store." I shook my head. "None of you care about your children or their future. All you're concerned about is your own wealth and how to protect it." "But a town without a doctor is a town that's dying," Miller muttered weakly. "You don't understand," I snapped. "Your town is already dead. It's decayed from the inside out, just like the morals of its leaders. I can't wait to get out of here. You all disgust me." "You can't leave," Miller gasped. "If you go now, you'll owe the government a huge sum of money." I scoffed at him. "The money from that life insurance policy you bought for Bonnie should cover it," I told him. "And if there's anything left, Holden Calloway can have it. I don't want any of your dirty money." I left them at the table, silent and staring at one another. I walked out to my car and checked the trunk to make sure my bags were secure and that I hadn't forgotten anything important. Then I started toward Arrow Point. When I reached the accident site, I pulled over and stood in front of the rough little cross one last time. I realized now that Bonnie had never loved me, but I had loved her, and it would take time to get over that. At the same time, I hated her for cheating on me, but I pitied her for having to give up the one she truly loved. It would take a long time to sort through all these conflicting emotions. Maybe I can find some help with that in Oklahoma City, I thought. I pointed my car in that direction and drove down the long, narrow highway, cutting straight through the heart of the prairie.